You were talking about jatis being the ones responsible for retaining and transmitting the Mahabharata. Um, and I'm wondering if we can understand something about why or how, if at all these are interesting questions, there are so many Mahabharatas. Because if these multiple jatis are responsible, then that must be, let's say, the mechanism, the reason why there are so many Mahabharatas. So
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. As we pointed out earlier, jatis are internally varied, internally self-dividing. They divide and then become a different jati. And then as the jatis develop, as we were trying to point out earlier, every jati has its own significant cultural forms. Every jati generates significant cultural forms. Okay? If that is so, there could be, if there are multiple jatis, then there are multiple cultural forms. Okay, that's why they say that one of the texts of the probably 9th century medieval India says that Jatyanantam tu sampraptum tadvaktum naiva shakyate. Jatis are ananta, infinite. To talk about them is not possible. Then next it says that Vidyanantascha kalascha Sankhyatum naiva shakyate. If you were to treat cultural forms as vidyas and kalas, okay, that which is learned by means of the mouth, that which is learned by means and rendered by means of gesture, kalas are rendered by means of gesture, vidyas are rendered by means of mouth, that is a speech and gesture that we were referring to earlier. Okay, if that were so, vidya anantascha kalascha, vidyas and kalas are so multiple, so infinite that Sankyatam, counting them is not possible. Okay, so there is a certain kind of significant relationship between jatis and cultural forms. So if the jatis multiply and jatis proliferate, so do cultural forms. They multiply and they proliferate. In fact, there is a need to understand this complex kind of relationship between jati and culture. But the problem is that we are kind of caught in a certain kind of uh, interpretive smog, if you like, that interpretive smog that has emerged from late 19th century onwards, which makes us see jati as a stigma. And we want to get rid of that. We do not want to talk about it. That's the problem. That's a certain kind of structural violence that we have imposed on ourselves. And this is causing a lot of problem. Today, it is many folklorists are deeply familiar with the jatis, but they do not want to mention these jatis in their work. They simply use the terms like community, this or that, but they do not want to use specific jati names because jati names are countless. What is significant of jati's contribution is that jatis render whatever they have received in a transformative manner, they re-articulate them. Whether it's Manganiyas or Langas or whoever, these jatis render the whatever they have received in different forms. In other words, they develop a specific idiom in their own language, a certain kind of cultural idiom in their own language. So, what these cultural forms have done is to actually carve out, chisel out a different language of communication on the one hand and different kind of gestural set on the other hand, and this is simply something that is living. We are barely able to understand this and then talk about them today, and this is something that needs to be seen. One of the interesting things I just said, that we are barely able to talk about it. The question is, how do we talk about it becomes very important, kind of very significant kind of question here. Do we write PhD theses on this, or do we simply create discourses about them? How do we begin to respond to them? Because these jatis have sustained themselves, sustained these cultural forms across periods and across generations. They have done that. Okay? But how do we respond to them is the major challenge today, especially those of us who come from the universities and academic institutions, and that becomes important. Okay? We have been created by the European cultural framing. That is, we study in the universities, we study in the schools and colleges, and then we tend to think that if you want to refer to a cultural form, talk about it, describe it, criticize it. That's what we tend to do. That becomes almost a kind of regular normal practice. Okay? But how do we respond to them is the question. How did these cultural forms respond to what they have received? Becomes important. When you begin to see in the Indian context, in various domains, whether it is architecture, music, whether it is kavya, poetry, or whether it is performance, dance. What is interesting here is that we do not have the discourse of the spectator, the viewer, the mere seer of this. That is that if you are listening to a Purana, or if you are watching a drama, or if you are listening to a musical rendering, you do not have the listener, the person who is kind of watching you, getting up and then writing a discourse about it. We do not have that. Structurally, that is absent in the Indian context. That is, the space of the spectator is silent largely. Okay, this is very interesting. This has happened across the centuries. Okay, no, but we know that we have the notions of Sahridaya. We have the notion of Sahridaya, but we don't have the discourse of the Sahridaya. Whereas in the European context, especially from 18th century onwards, but much further into the past also, from Plato's time onwards, we can trace it. What becomes important is that the discourse of the spectator becomes important. The person who is reading, the person who is watching, their discourse takes over. And this discourse is called either criticism or theory. It's a discourse of criticism or theory. We do not have such kind of thing until the European scenario came into existence. European framing of our understanding of our culture has come into existence. But does it mean that we do not have a critical response to what we have received? No, we do have. For example, I'll take two examples. One is that I mentioned that the 11th century, in the 11th century, Telugus have rendered Mahabharata into Telugu. What's interesting in that rendering, and this is not typical of Telugus, but this is something that we come across all regions in various places, whether Sarla Das or Kashi Ram Das in West Bengal, we come across this kind of thing. The person who rendered into Telugu, one of them among the three, is Nannaya. What he does is that he not only renders Vyasa's Mahabharata in his own way, but he also offers a commentary on the Vyasa in the same composition. In other words, the Mahabharata that you are reading in the 11th century is not just the Mahabharata of Vyasa, but it is rendered by this Telugu poet, but he is also offering a commentary on the poet, on the Mahabharata of Vyasa. So and it's all done in poetic form. In other words, the cultural form incorporates critical response to what has been received. So earlier what I was talking about as responsive reception, the response is something that is reflective, that provides a reflection on the cultural form that one has received and then renders it into a different form. So the space of the spectator or the space of the critic is not exclusively kept outside there. So the poets, the performers, the renderers of cultural form, they incorporate into their own work and it becomes a part of their work. For example, to take another one, this is, of course, courtly poet has done this, you might say, or somebody might say. In Pandavankali in Kerala, the stage begins, the scenario begins and then the performance is taking place. And the Sutradhar, after a certain kind of certain period of performance, the Sutradhar comes out and stands in front of the stage and tells the audience that, okay, we are going to perform this particular kind of play. And this play is like this, and gets back into the scene and starts dancing and invites questions from the audience and incorporates them in rendering it. So this is something that we come across in various kinds of performative traditions. In other words, there's something called critical response to, if one wants to use the word critical response, but response to the existing cultural form is incorporated in the generation of a different kind of or new kind of cultural form. So the space of the spectator exclusively, is something that does not get privileged in the Indian context. Whereas today we have created, and we tend to think that literary criticism, literary theory, or critical theory, or cultural theory, these are important kind of privileged discourses. We need to continue to render them. Whatever we may learn from these kind of theories, I'm not undermining them right away, but I'm emphasizing on the critical scenario in which we exist today. The cultural forms have transmitted themselves over centuries in that particular manner. And then here we are, with the baggage of another culture's understanding of itself, do we simply reimpose that particular form on the cultural creations that we are witnessing? Becomes a major challenge.
So we talked about multiple Mahabharatas, textual as well as multiple performance traditions and storytelling traditions, singing traditions. So when we think of archiving or preserving these traditions, these Mahabharatas, the textual ones are much easier for us to preserve. We know, in some sense, because we have libraries, we have a way of preserving documents. So we preserve these textual traditions, we preserve the manuscripts, or we reprint them. So, but what happens when we look at these performance traditions, which are so organically sustained by these communities? How do we preserve them, or how do we archive them, if we can talk like that?
Okay. Um, this is an important question, and I think it connects to what we've been saying earlier with regard to the question of memory and different ways of articulating memory. We pointed out that one way of articulating memory is actually by textualizing it. Okay, so anything that has been textualized, what we see in those scenarios is that your memory is rendered and externalized and recorded outside your body. So you create what can be called a substitute body or a surrogate body you create, and it is in that it is that surrogate body that retains the memory that you have. For example, paper or palm leaf or animal skin, they become the substitutes for the memory. In other words, something that you have retained earlier in your memory, in your body, you have rendered it outside and recorded it externally. Okay, so substitute body takes over the work of your memory, your body. Okay, and if you look at European history, you'll begin to see that it is these substitute bodies that have become, not just they have generated enormous amount of material, but they also have generated institutions like the archive, like the repository, like the library, like the museum, and a whole array today, the database. Okay, so all these have retained the memory externally and recorded it outside the body. Okay, so what we begin to see in the European cultural history is that continuous but gradual undermining of the body as the source of memory. Okay, so it gets, we know that technology can retain memory in much better way than human beings can. Yeah, that's something that's a commonplace understanding today. But the question that becomes important is that what can the surrogate body do to the memory that it is retaining, becomes an important question. That is that the library has huge amount of memory, but whose memory is that? What is it going to do with that memory? Again, another body enters that and then begins to evoke a certain kind of relationship between the library and this one. But in the Indian scenario, over generations, for centuries, what we begin to see is that the memory, as we were talking about it earlier, the memory gets articulated by means of the body itself. When you give importance to speech and gesture, song and narrative on the one hand, performance on the other, these cannot be rendered through substitute bodies. Your body will have to be put to work. When somebody claims that she's a dancer, she will have to dance. Her body will have to be put to work, and the body will put itself to work not by looking at a text or not by looking at a video. She renders it only through the memory that is embodied in her. Okay, so in fact, as I was saying, the guardians of memory that we refer to from various jatis, they become actually what can be called lively archives. They also retain memory, but this memory is lively. In other words, its significance can be seen only in the enactment of it, in the rendering of it. And each time when it is rendered, it changes. It becomes something very different, like Pura Apinavam. So it may be old. I may have received it from a great grandfather, but I am rendering it today. In the process, it gets transformed. So the lively archives have this tendency to transform themselves while replenishing what they have received, retain what they have received also. So the lively archives become very significant. But of course, we know that there is a danger today, or one might call danger, But I think this narrative of nostalgia for purity of the past is something that is that does not receive, in my view, all that great attention in the context of Indian cultural forms and the jatis that render these cultural forms. We don't have a sense of mourning for the lost as such. We are not melancholic people. We are not nostalgic people. It is something that we do not come across. How do we put to work this body becomes most important kind of thing, rather than how do I substitute myself with a surrogate body as such. By this, I'm not undermining the importance of archives and the museums, but Indian scenario throws up a very different kind of challenge. There may be terabytes and petabytes of memory in my computer, but what does my computer do with it unless I begin to ask it a question? So, such kind of questions were continuously asked in the context of lively archives. So, what do we do with this lively archives? Both in the 19th century and the 20th century, and even today, largely the discipline called folklore is bent upon simply preserving it. And the moment you preserve it, it becomes a part of the dead wood. It gets accumulated, largely inaccessible to people, and we do not know what to do with it quite often. So you brand it as a certain kind of folkloric work, and then nobody bothers to look at it. But the Indian scenario throws up a different kind of challenge. Who are the creators of these cultural forms whom you're trying to archive? If you take a look at your classroom where you teach, whether school or college or university, you have students who have come from these jatis. They're the heirs and the legatees of the cultural forms of the lively archives. These are the people. So there are certainly connections. If you have a student, Bhil students in your classroom. If you as a teacher, you're familiar with what Bhil culture has done, and then the Bhopas and the Bhopis, what they have done. And this boy or the girl has no connection to that culture. For a generation or so, he's been distanced. But you can begin to explore the ways in which the reconnection between the cultural forms of which he is the legatee, he is the receiver of that cultural form. And then that might spark off something in that person, and that would contribute to a generation of something different. So I think a lot of extraordinary amount of work needs to be done over generations to reconnect. In the last 100 years, 200 years, 150 years, what has happened is distancing between culture and jati has happened. And today, our classrooms cannot get away and get rid of jatis. They're still there. So the legatees of the cultural forms and formations are there with you. How do you begin to, kind of re-articulate their relationship to their cultural forms is a major challenge. Preservation is not going to help us. Preservation per se, as such, alone is not going to help us. New kind of experimental work will have to emerge. New kind of cultural forms will continue to emerge. Here, critical treatises alone are not going to be helpful. Okay, one can do a PhD, but what are the different ways in which new cultural forms can be generated? So one response, it seems to me, and there's an experimental work that we have undertaken and is going on. One way in which one can, while being sensitive to the fact that in the Indian cultural scenario, the space of the spectators or spectators' discourse has never been given any privilege. Keeping that and being sensitive to that, while confronting the problem of how to reconnect the cultural formations, that is the jatis that are there in your class, to their heritage. Yeah, keeping that at the back of our mind, it seems to me that new cultural forms will have to be generated. And these new cultural forms will have to come on the basis of, again, responsive reception. What your generations of culture has done over a long period of time, and the cultural forms that you have inherited, what are the ways in which you can begin to re-articulate them in the contemporary scenario? So new cultural forms will have to come in. Okay, new cultural forms, as I pointed out earlier, Indian cultural forms cannot be divided into critical and creative. They combine themselves. They articulate themselves in the creation of a different different form. So probably I think through this kind of new exercise, new kind of creative, activity, I think sustenance of these cultural forms, along with the cultural formations, can happen. So to undertake this, we need to overcome two major hurdles. We should be in a position to talk fearlessly and without any inhibition about the Jati and Jati cultural inheritances, because culture is there only. It's not there in the archives. Okay, folklorists are simply archiving the Jati cultures. That's not going to be a solution to your problem. Okay. Second thing is that while learning from whatever is available, while learning from the critical strategies that the university over a period of time has developed, we need to realize that there are very deep limitations to that. So we need to be able to overcome that. So the critical and creative divide that European culture has imposed on the rest of the world is not necessarily universal. And we need to overcome that, because the cultural forms never divided creativity and criticality in that sense. So we need to be able to overcome that. Then I think something new will come into existence. Yeah. For that, I think institutional changes will have to be made, and that's a different scenario we can talk about.
When we just bringing together all these different strands that we've been discussing, we've seen that this idea of Mahabharata as memory does not have focus on the occurrence of an event as truth. That's not what they're concerned about. At the same time, there's a multiplicity of Mahabharatas. Different jatis sustain different versions, different retellings of the story. And lively archives, these performance traditions, these oral retelling traditions, singing traditions, each performance will be different, each person's performance in the same tradition will be different. So in some sense, if we are to talk about it like this, every time somebody goes to this archive, they will come out with something different.
Exactly.
Whereas in this documentary, like this library archive, it's you go 100 years ago, you go today, you go 100 years later, it's still going to be the same thing. So how we can then begin to understand is that the way that perhaps Indian culture has approached this memory, Mahabharata, is what do you do with it? Not only in terms of the performance and how I'm going to portray this on the stage or in front of an audience, but rather what will the people who are watching it do with it in their life?
Exactly.
So that becomes kind of the focus, rather than any understanding of some original and the particular story that has to be told.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not an interpretive culture in the sense that the significance of a particular culture form is not contingent, not dependent on how best you can interpret it. If there is such an interpretive work as such, and we can't call it interpretive because it has a very specific meaning in the European textualist tradition. So we will have to simply say the way you respond to it becomes very significant. How sensitive you are to the implications of what you have received, and then what you do with these kind of implications in your response becomes very important. So we need to emphasize how do you respond, and respond for what? Respond to transform your own way of living. That becomes important, because either the Mahabharata or Puranas or any of the cultural forms, they are oriented towards transformative modes of existence. That is, within the same existence, in the life that we live, how do we begin to transform ourselves? What are the ways in which we can transform ourselves? So this becomes an absolutely significant kind of question, and this question moves from the Vedic heritage to these other kinds. I mean, Mahabharata or a whole range of other cultural forms, the heritage of other cultural forms also. It percolates down, it connects them, not in a continuous way, but in transformative ways. I'm not saying that there's a only one continuous line that is available, linear line that can be seen. No, it is internally transformative, constantly dynamic. That's the reason why these cultural forms sustain themselves and survive. Even to this day, for example, one of the great exponents and the person who has been extraordinarily fascinated by Mahabharata throughout his life is Ashish Nandi. Ashish Nandi constantly talks about how Indian film draws on the themes of the Mahabharata. There are many kind of films he analyzes, especially in the modern period, highlighting Karna. Why is it films have highlighted Karna in the modern period? So it's very interesting kind of analysis he provides.
So we've talked about Mahabharata being discussed as flawed history or in European categories. but there is an Indian category in under which Mahabharata is widely recognized. I think it also says it about itself that it is itihasa, and often itihasa is translated as history. But then, as we've seen in our discussion so far, history, while it is completely concerned with the event, with the truth of the occurrence of an event, uh, Mahabharata is not that. It's not concerned with that at all. So if we say that then Itihasa is not concerned with that at all, then does it make sense to say that history and Itihasa have two different conceptions of truth? Can we talk in that way? Does that help us at all?
I think so because the word literally itihasa means the way it happened. This is what happened. Okay, itihasa. This is how it happened. Okay, now that does not mean that it's an event as such, a privileged event as such, a privileged event which is meant to be the originator of a particular kind of history or past as such, or a legacy as such. Okay, this is how it happened. Okay, that does not necessarily mean that it need not happen again as such. Yeah, it is something frozen moment in the past as such. Those implications are not there. And then itihasa is not in that particular sense that something that has happened, that has occurred, yeah, something that has occurred has a possibility of repeating itself subsequently also in different kinds of lives. So that's why one way of referring to something that has happened in the Indian tradition is itihasa. And the itihasa does not necessarily mean it's a particular genre as such, a particular kind of poetic form as such. In fact, Puranas also have itihasas. Okay, they give the episodes of certain kind of occurrences that have happened in the past. Okay, so these itihasas can be found in many kind of cultural forms. Okay, so Indian scenario, in my view, does not rigorously, in strict way, categorize poetic forms as such, or categorize cultural forms as such. It is not possible for us to rigorously distinguish one from the other. Kavya can draw on the Puranas. That does not mean that Kavya is treated as Purana, but Puranas are also Kavyas. Yeah, for Itihasa can be a Kavya. For example, Ramayana is considered Adi Kavya, but it is also Purana and Kavya. So there are no very rigorous distinctions that can be made. There are certain kind of features that are identified with the Itihasa. Yeah, but Puranas themselves, they're, if you like, self-reflecting. In other words, they try to tell you what they are doing and the form in which they are doing it. Okay, so Purana defines itself as Sargascha Pratisargascha Vamsho Manvantaranicha Vamshanucharita Utata Purananam Panchalakshanam. It has 5 lakshanas, 5 characteristics. So it tells us about the emergence of Srishti, and then repetition of Srishti, and then the lineages of kings. Okay, and then so it has 5 different characteristics it identifies. Okay, but you can't go on the basis of that template and then try to examine Puranas, because Puranas don't simply subscribe to that. They are transformative constantly. Not all Puranas subscribe to these 5 lakshanas, 5 characteristics. There may be many characteristics. In other words, nobody can exhaustively define a particular cultural form on the basis of a set standard features as such. That's what the cultural forms are trying to tell you. Okay, so with regard to, once we have given this, so it's not a genre written in stone as such.